Hello everyone, Big Clinky here, with another My Thoughts On video, but this one's going to be a bit different to the norm. Instead of giving my thoughts on a new game that I played recently, I'm instead giving my thoughts on one mode from a game that's, I guess, quite old now, that's one of my favourite games of all time, but it's a mode that I hadn't played until just now. Welcome to My Thoughts On Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn Hard Mode. It all started around a month or so ago, when I booted up Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn for my Wii, mainly just to see how my capture device handled it, because I'll be recording the game again some point this year. But I hadn't played the game itself in a very long time, so I thought I may as well do another playthrough just to refamiliarize myself with it. And then I saw the difficulty screen and thought, I've never actually beaten this game on hard before. I kinda want to try just to prove I can do it. I normally don't enjoy the higher difficulty levels of Fire Emblem games, but because I consider Radiant Dawn my second favourite game in the series, only slightly behind Genealogy of the Holy War, it felt weird there was an entire mode that I hadn't played before, so I thought I may as well give it a shot. I had heard major horror stories about this mode, which is why I didn't plan on playing it earlier. Before I get to those stories though, I want to take a bit of time to explain just why hard mode in this game is so difficult compared to your average hard mode. It's because it's not really hard mode, it's actually Maniac mode. The English version of Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn renamed the difficulty levels from the Japanese version. So, what in English is easy, normal, and hard, in Japanese is actually normal, hard, and Maniac. Yes, the mode that advertises itself in the English version as the standard difficulty setting is in fact a giant lie. It's actually hard mode, one above the standard difficulty setting. And the mode advertised as hard mode is in fact more akin to the lunatic mode introduced in later games. I've always disliked this renaming of the modes because it gave a lot of people the impression that this game was a lot harder than it actually is. Made even worse by the fact that in Path of Radiance, the difficulties were also called easy, normal, and hard, and in fact had the same descriptions they do in Radiant Dawn, but Path of Radiance is totally different. They actually removed the Japanese version's Maniac mode and created a new easy mode specifically for the English version. So the difficulty names there are entirely accurate. In Radiant Dawn, they rename the difficulties without changing them at all. In fact, I've heard the English version actually increase the stats of some of the enemies, so if anything, they're harder than they were in the Japanese version. So you now know that this mode is actually called Maniac mode, and it really lives up to that name. Other than just the enemies having increased stats, and a few of the time chapters having slightly lower turn limits, I think. This mode changes a few of the basic mechanics of the game, some in ways that have never been done even on the highest difficulty levels of other Fire Emblem games. I'll be discussing how I feel about these changes now. The first is that on this mode, you can't view the movement ranges of enemies, and not in the sense that you can't lock in their ranges. You simply can't view their movement at all. You hover the cursor over an enemy, nothing appears. Essentially, you're forced to count out the number of spaces they can move yourself by going into their stat screen and looking at their movement stats. This was one of the main reasons that I didn't want to play this mode earlier. And early on in the game, this definitely cost me a few resets, especially when it came to movement costs. So while it's easy to see the actual movement ranges of enemy classes, I personally don't have each class's movement cost over various terrain memorized, other than vague things like mages can move freely through desert while cavalry get very, very heavily slowed down by it. But there's an early chapter that has a few cavalry and a lot of bushes, and it left me thinking, how much do cavalry get slowed down by bushes again? That led to a lot of annoying trial and error. Also, Radiant Dawn has a mechanic called height, so there are these ledges in the game that cost a certain amount of movement to climb up or down, and it took me a while to figure out exactly how much movement climbing up or down a ledge costs, and you need to know this because as early as 1-2, there's a chapter where there's a couple of archers who, if you're not careful with their exact movement range, including a ledge, will splatter Micaiah in one hit. Through trial and error, I eventually realized that it costs exactly 3 movement to go up or down a ledge, but until I learned that, this was an exercise in pain. Another exercise in pain is playing this annoying game of Russian roulette with, does this boss move or not? Without the ability to see movement ranges, it's often hard to predict which bosses will move to attack you and which will stay where they are, and it's not always logical to the mission objective. Specific case, 1-1. The boss of this chapter is guarding an escape point, but he will move to attack you, and Micaiah found this out the hard way in one of my attempts. On the other hand, some bosses in route missions are completely stationary, even though it makes no logical sense for them to be like that. Meanwhile, there are some bosses in defeat boss chapters who do move and will easily kill themselves if you have the right character in their range, which is kinda stupid. I learned that from speedruns. The strange thing about this feature of hard mode, though, is that I got used to it as I went through the game. Early on, it was a nightmare and cost me many resets, but later, I didn't really mind not being able to view enemy ranges. In fact, it didn't affect the way I played the game at all. It's gonna be weird going back and actually being able to view enemy ranges now because I'm so used to not being able to do it. The change in hard mode that I personally dislike the most is the complete removal of the weapon triangle. Yep, they're going back to the Gaiden days here. Oh, and also map affinity doesn't do anything, but who cares about map affinity in this game? The main reason why I dislike the removal of the weapon triangle is it doesn't really make the game any harder. If anything, it actually makes it easier, but for all the wrong reasons. You see, there was already a bit of an imbalance in the weapon types in the original game. Axes are very good in Radiant Dawn. Not helped by the fact that a lot of the most broken characters in the game are axe users. Losing the weapon triangle to swords at least gave them some kind of drawback. On the other hand, sword users, especially ones who join early in the game like Edward, desperately need the edge the weapon triangle gives them. Swords have low power, so the extra might really helps, and swordmasters have such low strength overall that they need that niche of being able to hard counter axe users through the fact that axe users just can't hit them. Also, mages. Mages were, in my opinion, already pretty bad in Radiant Dawn, but the lack of the weapon triangle makes them even worse, because now fire, thunder, and wind magic are all essentially the same thing, aside from the occasional effectiveness bonus against certain classes. Soren in Part 3 exemplifies this perfectly to me. He starts with a fire, a thunder, and a wind tome in his inventory. And without the weapon triangle, I just wouldn't care which one of these I used against an enemy, unless one of them's higher might made a one-round KO possible when the others couldn't do that. These 3 magic types all have their own weapon triangle effectiveness and ranks associated with them, but on hard mode it might as well be like the later Fire Emblem games where there's just one type of magic, tomes, and I personally really don't like that system. To me, the lack of the weapon triangle just removes a lot of the strategy of the game and makes it more about brute force. Isn't hard mode supposed to make you think more? Not so much without the weapon triangle. It doesn't matter which type of unit fights which type of enemy. All that matters is just raw stats. If anything, hard mode encourages you to just barrel through everything with your most overpowered characters, rather than actually thinking about where to position them and who to fight. And that just isn't that enjoyable in a Fire Emblem game to me. There's another reason why I don't like the removal of the weapon triangle though, and that is biorhythm. So, biorhythm is this annoying mechanic that's in both Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, where characters will randomly have a positive or negative modifier to their hit rate and evasion, depending on at what level their biorhythm sine wave is at. In Path of Radiance, this isn't nearly as annoying, because biorhythm only changes for every 10 enemies the character fights, and also every character's starting biorhythm position is fixed at the moment of their recruitment. In Radiant Dawn, biorhythm is a lot more random. Not only does it fluctuate every turn, but every character's starting biorhythm is randomized at the beginning of every chapter. The effects of biorhythm are also a lot larger in Radiant Dawn. Rather than plus or minus 5 hit and evasion like Path of Radiance, they can range up to plus or minus 10 hit and evade. And remember that enemies have biorhythm too. So, if you're in worse biorhythm and the enemy is in best, you're losing 20 hit and evasion. The reason why biorhythm is so irritating on hard mode is because there's no weapon triangle to help offset the hit and evasion penalty. That at least gave you a way to mitigate the effects of bad biorhythm on the other difficulties, but you don't have that fallback on hard. You're stuck with whatever the biorhythm gives you. And if a crucial character's biorhythm happens to be at worst on a crucial turn, that can really screw you over due to nothing but pure bad luck. And that's what's annoying about this. Biorhythm just adds so much more luck to the game, and without the weapon triangle to offset it, the luck is just even worse. A perfect example of how much biorhythm can affect things was me fighting the boss of one endgame with Jill. Our hit rates ranged from 80-30 my way to 80-30 his way, depending on the position of both of our biorhythms. And that's just insane. Now, there is a third change to hard mode, but it only affects the English version. You can't battle save. You instead just get the standard suspend save that is automatically deleted when you return to the chapter. The reason why it only affects the English version? Battle saves didn't exist in the Japanese version, so hard mode is just restoring the game to the way it played there. And personally, I don't like abusing battle saves anyway. The only time that I'll ever really use them is if I want to show different boss conversations in the same attempt of a chapter, so this didn't affect me all that much. When I lose someone in a chapter, I like to restart the whole thing even if I have a battle save in place. It just feels cheap loading that. Those are the only core mechanics changes in hard, and they're the ones most people know about. But one other thing that I feel is a significant change is the overall reduced experience on hard difficulty. You get a lot less experience from battle. I've seen many sources say that it's outright halved. It doesn't look halved to me, but it's definitely lower. But that is nothing compared to what hard mode does to bonus experience. Not only is all the bonus experience you receive from every source half of what you get on normal mode, but they also severely jacked up the amount of bonus experience you need to raise your character's levels. As early as Part 2, it was taking 100 bonus experience to give a character 1 point of real experience. And this stifling of bonus experience really affected my playthrough, because when I normally play this game, bonus experience is a huge part of the way I play it. I make use of the way bonus experience is guaranteed to give exactly 3 stat increases, regardless of the number of stats you've capped, by training my characters with normal experience until they've capped all their good stats, then using bonus experience to raise their bad stats. Doing things this way, I'm usually able to cap all the stats of everyone on my main party by the time of the final boss. Even the one time I actually used Meg, she capped everything. This was so much harder to do on hard mode, and I've gone into endgame with not perfect stats on a lot of my characters. Which I guess does make the game harder, so it definitely accomplished its goal there. But because bonus experience is pretty much quartered in effectiveness compared to normal mode, it also meant a lot of my characters were underleveled for certain points, at least compared to where they normally are. For example, I usually have Edward and Nolan in 3rd tier by 313, and I usually have Aaron in second tier at that point, even if I don't plan on seriously using him. On hard mode, both Edward and Nolan were only level 8 second tier at that point, which is a pretty considerable difference. And the annoying thing about this is, this underleveledness really only affected the Dawn Brigade. The Grail Mercenaries pretty much hit third tier at around the point they usually do in my normal playthroughs. Ha hit third tier during 3.8, and everyone else hit third tier during 3.10. The difference was I had much less people hitting third tier. I was only able to third tier Titania, Shinnon, and Nephany by 3.10, when I usually have Gatry, Oscar, and sometimes even Reese third tier at that point too. It reminds me of an inverse of the way some people use the experience share in the newer Pokemon games. They balance out the increased experience by using more Pokemon on their team. Here, it's reversed, in the fact that the lower amount of experience is balanced out by me using less people on my team. I still have them at around the same levels they'd be in a normal playthrough, I just have less of them. But, at least I actually have third tiers. Again, the Dawn Brigade really suffers from the lack of experience because they're already very playtime starved as it is. And this is going to lead me into, in my opinion, why I don't like hard mode in this game so much. It's less about making the game harder. Well, it is, but all it really does is exasperate the normal difficulty curve of the game. Radiant Dawn, as many people know, is a game with a very unbalanced difficulty curve. The very beginning with the Dawn Brigade is insanely hard, but once you get to Ike's party, things are insanely easy. Hard only exasperates this. The beginning goes from insanely hard to sheer hell, and the Dawn Brigade chapters in Part 3 are slightly lesser hell, but still hell. The Grail Mercenaries parts, even on hard mode, are still quite easy. And 4 endgame is still as easy or as hard as you want it to be, depending on the number of Laguz Royals you're willing to bring. Now, I love Radiant Dawn, it's one of my favourite games of all time, but even I agree that the game is definitely badly balanced between the parties, and hard mode only makes the balance discrepancy worse. The Grail Mercenaries are still amazing, and the Dawn Brigade still really struggles, and their few good members have even less experience to actually get good. And the number of Dawn Brigade characters who are viable goes down heavily because some of them who are good on lower difficulties are really not good here, as I found out the hard way. Now, Edward is one of my favourite characters in the game, he always has been, but using him on hard mode, I am definitely seeing his flaws, and I can fully understand why people consider him bad on this mode. Firstly, the lack of weapon triangle really hurts him early on. Secondly, the lack of experience means you can't afford to train as many people in the Dawn Brigade. And thirdly, and to me most importantly, enemies have much higher speed stats on hard than they do on normal. Throughout all of Part 1, the only enemies Edward could reliably double were mages, and that's really sad. A lot of enemy classes that you wouldn't normally expect to have high speed do on hard mode. The bandits in 1.8, for some reason, they have like 17 to 18 in strength, speed, and defense, which is kinda crazy for that point in the game. Even Nolan had trouble with them. Later on, they were replaced in the strangely speedy department by generals. Generals on Radiant Dawn Hard have a surprising amount of speed. In fact, it's almost around the level of their strength and defense stats, which for general standards aren't usually much higher than basic enemies. So, I tend to think of hard mode generals as less generals and more slow-moving halberdiers. That's really what they are. In fact, the increased speed stats overall even affected the more powerful characters. Ha's offense really suffered in endgame for me because he stopped being able to effectively double enemies. Now, admittedly, I got a little bit unlucky with his speed growth, but still, the fact that Ha had issues doubling generals in endgame was kind of weird. Now that I've gone over hard mode in general, I just want to relate a few anecdotes from the chapters themselves. Which chapters gave me trouble and which didn't. So let's start with Part 1. The early chapters in part 1 were, like I said, absolute hell, and it doesn't help that you're getting used to the lack of enemy movement ranges at this point too, so you have a lot of information to keep track of, and it's very easy to make a mistake. And on hard, early on, you cannot afford to make a single mistake. You make one wrong move, you've lost the chapter. Additionally, due to your overall lower stats on your characters, bad luck can screw you over a lot more than it would later in the game. You get unlucky and miss an 80% hit rate with Nolan, and things tend to go downhill quickly. Even worse, this vulnerability to bad luck also equates to vulnerability to bad biorhythm. If key characters like Nolan are in bad biorhythm at the start of a chapter, you're also in a bit of an uphill battle, which is very, very annoying. However, I found things got a lot easier once I got past 1-3. 1-4, despite being full of Tiger Lagoos who are terrifying later on in the game, is actually pretty easy in my opinion. And because it's a route chapter full of enemies that give a lot of experience, it's a nice breather where you're forced to train your characters, which, again, is an opportunity you don't often get on hard mode. 1-5 is a chapter where I'd heard horror stories about NPC AI, especially Jill. And here's the weird thing, I never lost this chapter due to Jill dying, but I feel like it's only because the AI took mercy on me. There were many times where Jill made a move where I thought, nope, she's dead, I've lost. But the AI, even though it easily could have killed her, didn't. They all decided to gang up on Zihak or Taroniu. It was really weird. Apart from me failing one attempt of 1-6 part 2 due to Fiona charging a Myrmidon and getting criticaled, don't you just love NPC AI? The rest of part 1 wasn't all that bad. But there's one thing that I will say. To my shame, I had to resort to boss abuse in 1-7 and 1 endgame. There simply wasn't a lot of experience available, and I know that I probably screwed myself over by trying to use Edward, but I like him, sue me. So, Nolan and Jill weren't promoted by the time of 1 endgame, and I knew they really, really needed to be, so I boss abused the boss there for a very, very long time, around 70 turns, but I was able to get both of them promoted by the end of the chapter. One other thing I will say about part 1 is I got a bizarrely RNG blessed Micaiah. She actually kept defense without the aid of any Draco shields. But an RNG blessed Micaiah is still Micaiah, so it's not like it really counted for all that much. It was pretty funny though, I actually considered taking a screenshot, but I forgot to. Part 2, only 2 chapters really gave me trouble. 2-1, partially due to just the low pool of characters you have, but also because the boss and his lackeys are weird in their AI. They do move, but it's often hard to predict when they will. So I had many attempts where Brom was a little bit weakened and the boss suddenly moved and killed him. Speaking of which, the file I used for transfer bonuses was definitely not optimal, which made the game a little bit harder. It was an old joke playthrough of Path of Radiance I did, and so Nephany and Marsha were really the only relevant people to get stat boosts. So Nephany was pretty awesome here, and Marsha was also surprisingly awesome in both 2P and 2-3. Speaking of 2-3 though, that one also gave me a bit of trouble. Although interestingly, it turns out I've been missing the point of this chapter in all these years I've been playing this game. You get bonus experience for every enemy that is alive by the chapter's end, so you're encouraged to just speedrun the thing with Jeffrey with as little bloodshed as possible, which actually makes sense from a story standpoint. So, I went to Gwimpage's amazing AGDQ speedrun of Radiant Dawn for tips, because I love that video. And then I found out that speedrun was not only done on easy mode, but Jeffrey had transfer bonuses. So, things weren't exactly so simple in my run. Weirdly, the catapults near the castle are actually kind of a threat on hard mode. They still do very minimal damage, but the sheer number of enemies there can easily overwhelm Jeffrey if he's been weakened even a tiny bit. There's also a really annoying Rider's Bane Paladin hanging around there. I failed this chapter many times, but the one time I succeeded, I used an interesting tactic. I ordered all of the NPCs to target and all move to that spot where the Rider's Bane Paladin was to act as baits. Mean, I know, but the sheer saturation of NPCs drew the catapult's fire away from Jeffrey and Kieran. Also, putting the NPCs on target rather than roam meant they didn't kill the enemies on their path. So, through that distraction, Kieran and Jeffrey were able to get the Speedwing, break the door, and kill the boss. 2 endgame is pretty easy, just like I remember it being, but I like that because it's one of my favourite chapters in the entire series thanks to its music, the overall atmosphere, and for being a genuinely fun defend chapter, which is a rarity in the series. It's a nice breather. My main strategy involved having Ha single-handedly tank the left side of the map, while Mordecai, constantly chugging Olivia grass, tanked the right side of the map, which was useful because due to his slow speed, he doesn't kill a lot of enemies, so Nefany, Marsha, and Khalil were able to pick off a lot of them and get the experience. And once I felt I got enough experience out of the map, I had Ha lure in Ludwig and had Alincia smash his face in, like I usually love to end this, although Alincia needed an energy drop to have enough strength to one round kill him. So now we come to part 3. Like I said earlier, the Grail Mercenaries chapters in part 3 are generally pretty easy. I did have some problems with 3-1 though, for 2 main reasons. Firstly, Fog of War route chapters are terrible, and whoever came up with that idea deserves to be fired, which is really going to become apparent later on. Secondly, Leth and Liar's AI is beyond moronic. It is outright suicidal. On many attempts, the 2 of them attacked enemies who were guaranteed to kill them. Nice job, NPCs. And you can't even put them on halt either, because reinforcements spawn at the start of the map near where they are. In the end, I decided screw it and just let them go down. I looked it up and it turns out they both don't die if they fall in this chapter. Liar is terrible, but this is still a 100% recruitment run, so no one's dying here. It just meant I lost out on bonus experience, but bonus experience isn't as useful on hard anyway, so that really didn't matter. Nothing much eventful happened during the rest of the Grail Mercenaries chapters, apart from me not being able to kill the boss of 3-5. I'm a quote-unquote completionist with Fire Emblem maps, so if there's an optional boss, I kill them. That annoyed me. But then we come to 3-6, the chapter that I was dreading the most. I'd heard horror stories about this. I'd heard that if the Dawn Brigade wasn't set up exactly right, this chapter could be outright unwinnable and you'd have to restart the game. So I finally get there and surprisingly, it's not as bad as I thought it would be. It only took me 2 attempts, and I would have finished it on the first one if it weren't for the fact that Edward got really unlucky with dodges on the last turn. I chalked my easy time with this chapter up mostly to Nolan with Beastbane being amazing, something I hadn't really realised before. Even as a level 1 warrior, with Tarvos and Beastbane, Nolan could 1-hit KO everything on the map, including the tigers. And he shot up all the way from level 1 to level 6 or 7. The map mostly consisted of Edward and Nolan going up to the bushes on the northwestern side of the map, tanking everything with their A supports. I know that Nolan and Zehawk probably would have been a better support, but I like the idea of Edward and Nolan supporting from a lore standpoint, the idea of the older mentor helping out the younger rookie. But anyway, on the other side of the defense line, Volug and Zehawk supported, because Double Earth is awesome. Volug dodge tanked everything, Micaiah sniped enemies from behind him, Jill flew and picked off weakened enemies with her Brave Axe, and Soph mostly stood there being useless because even with the Beast Killer dagger, he dies in 2 hits to the enemies, doesn't dodge all that reliably, and I just couldn't risk him on the front lines. Not to mention that his accuracy wasn't that reliable either. So, yeah. Pretty typical Soth, sadly. All in all, not too bad. The rest of the Grail Mercenary, so I'll skip to the point of the Dawn Brigade's return, 3-12. This chapter, I was starting to really feel the Dawn Brigade's lack of experience. In most of my playthroughs, I have enough bonus experience to get Edward and Nolan decently leveled, also Jill, and I also tend to have Aaron promoted by now. I almost never bring Aaron to endgame, but I feel that he does really help with choke pointing in the Dawn Brigade's Part 3 chapters, because he's one of the few tanks that they have, and Toronio isn't around for very long. So things were a little tricky in this playthrough, because Edward and Nolan were the only decently leveled characters I had, and Edward can't really choke point without evasive terrain. Fortunately, I was helped by Gasp, the NPCs. Not so much for them being useful, but more for the fact the AI here seems to take mercy on you and prioritizes killing the NPCs over killing your characters. By the end of the chapter, very few NPCs were left alive, but they did their job very well. Two other interesting things happened here. The first was that Toroniu spent the entire chapter throwing javelins at one enemy, and didn't manage to actually kill it until the very last turn. The second was that bishops were really the MVP NPCs, that's a mouthful, of this playthrough. They always knew who to prioritize healing, and later on in the chapter, one of them even threw himself onto the front lines, acting as a human shield to protect my characters, and the best part was, he lived. It's funny, there's almost always an NPC hero in my playthroughs, but it's almost never that one archer in 3.13. And speaking of 3.13, that chapter wasn't that bad either, and it was once again due to Nolan and Beastbane, but yet another combo that I'd never realized before, and I can't believe I haven't. Beastbane plus crossbow equals fun. Insert maniacal laughter here. So for those who don't know, crossbows don't use your strength stat, they operate purely on the weapon's might. To compensate, crossbows have an insane amount of might, which usually doesn't do much because enemies still have quite high defense stats to negate most of it. But remember that the effectiveness bonus is triple the weapon's might. So if a crossbow gets the effectiveness bonus, which is usually against a flyer, the flyer tends to explode into thousands of chunks. Now, the main basic enemies in this chapter are Beast Lagoos and Hawk Lagoos. Beastbane means effectiveness bonus against the beasts, and crossbows naturally have effectiveness bonus against flying units. So, Nolan with a crossbow has effectiveness bonus against every basic enemy on the map. And with a crossbow, that means that he does like 72 base damage to them. That's more health than any enemy has. Way more than any enemy has. Even the tigers can't stand up to that. And what's funnier is the type of crossbow he was using has a slightly increased crit rate as well, so he sometimes brutally overkilled enemies by critting them with 72 base damage. Yeah, I like to joke that that wasn't just killing them, it outright erased them from existence. That's how high the damage was. So Nolan essentially defended the fortress single-handedly, but I also needed to plug the gaps, lest the enemies break through my lines and go to places where Nolan couldn't hit them. And here is where my lack of characters showed once again. I normally have people like Aaron trained, who can be used to plug the gaps. I can't use untrained characters for this, because the Hawks will just fly past and pick them off. I normally have Laura promoted here, for example, so she can usually take one round of combat from a Hawk. So with less trained characters, I had to rely on NPCs to plug some of the gaps, and this was working for a short time. So everything was going perfectly smoothly, and then one halberdier who was on the central gap decided it would be a good idea for him to run back and get healed by a bishop. He was the one thing holding my defense line together. With him gone, the enemies spilled through the gap, and the chapter instantly went from perfectly safe, I'm at no risk of ever losing, to oh crap, panic now, panic now, panic now. I was miraculously able to turn things around, which really shocked me, because at the time I was fully resigned to the fact that that one NPC had cost me the chapter for being dumb. The worst part was, that halberdier was in no danger. If he had stood where he was for the rest of the chapter, there was no risk of any enemy ever being able to attack him. But NPC AI is all like, "Oh, I've been hurt, I'm gonna run back and heal." After that, 3 endgame really wasn't that bad. I'd actually 3rd tiered Soren just to make getting him into meteor range of Peleus easier. For those wondering, having Soren fight Peleus in that chapter is one of the criteria for unlocking the secret ending, and I always go for it because, personally, I find 3 endgame incredibly boring if you're not going for that. The enemies are all really weak, and the chapter just sort of ends on its own. I was able to do that, but getting through Edward and Nolan was kind of tricky. especially Nolan. And oh boy, I am not looking forward to that chapter in my Radiant Dawn recorded playthrough that I'll be doing, because Edward will almost certainly be 3rd tier by then, and that's going to be terrifying. So on to part 4, and I had to split up a lot of my best characters across the parties. Har, Marsha, and Jill all went on Team Micaiah because she has a desert chapter, you want as many flyers as possible there. Edward and Nephany went on Team Tiban because they were the lowest level characters I planned on taking to endgame, and Team Tiban has a lot of opportunities to gain experience, especially in 4-5. That just left Titania, Soren, and Shinnon for Team Ike, and weirdly enough, his party had the toughest time in this part by far. I thought, I've got Titania there, I've got Shinnon, I've got Ike who's forced and he's great, I have Nyla who's forced and she's also amazing, I'm not going to have any trouble in Ike's chapters, right? Wrong. The only chapters that remotely gave me any sort of trouble in part 4 were 4-1 and 4-4. And those 2 chapters are now my most hated chapters in the entire game. 4-1 is a Fog of War route chapter, so that's bad. Fog of War route chapters with lots of reinforcements are even worse. But what's even worse than that is Fog of War route chapters with lots of reinforcements where the reinforcement spawn points can be anywhere on the map. It's not like they spawn from doors, stairs, or forts. The reinforcements in part 4 teleport onto the battlefield. And in Fog of War, if you don't have direct line of sight to anywhere they're warping in, you'll just hear the warp sound and that's it. You have no indication as to where the reinforcements are, what type of reinforcements they are, how many of them there are. It's just really painful. So at one point during the chapter, I decided to have Volug go and check out one of the top corners. It turned out there were 3 enemies there, and Volug just barely made it through with his life. Another time, I start walking down the left-hand side of the map and, oh, there's a Falcon Knight here. Oh, it's in range of Raphael. Oh, I have no one who can rescue Raphael. Isn't this fun? I feel like all the issues with this chapter would be resolved if it was a defeat boss map, not route. But being route, you have to scour the entire Fog of War map for every last enemy, and with the reinforcements incessantly spawning in, and you have no idea where they're going to appear unless you've memorized it in advance. It was painful. 4-4 is also painful for being a route map with a lot of reinforcements, but this one isn't Fog of War, so why is it so bad? Simply the sheer numbers of reinforcements. I'd forgotten how many reinforcements there were in this one, and spamming this many reinforcements in a route chapter is just insane. I didn't have enough characters to cover every last corner of the map to kill off the reinforcements on the enemy phase before they could become a problem. So, eventually, the lower part of the map just became choked with swarms of reinforcements, and I was forced to just slowly wade through them. Route maps should not have this many reinforcements. Now I want to go back and watch Gwimpage's speedrun, because actually beating this chapter fast enough so that the reinforcements don't get too ridiculous is a feat in and of itself, especially since there were over 50 enemies starting on the map anyway, some of which are hidden behind doors you have to unlock. By contrast, Har and the rest of the Flyer crew trivialized most of Micaiah's chapters, and as for Tiban's, well, 4-2, Edward soloed I'd say 60% of the map due to promoting to Trueblade, and nothing could hit him at all, and Nephany handled the rest, while 4-5 was still not that bad thanks to Nephany with Beastbane, Volk, and Edward, and also a Lince with Birdfoe flying around and killing off the Flyers. Oh, and in both cases you also have Tiban, and he's just completely stupid. I'd forgotten that on top of his ridiculous stats they'd also given him 10 movements. Seriously. So, everyone is now met up for the final battle. What was endgame like? Pretty much the exact same as it is on normal mode. You still juggernaut through everything with a party of one-man/woman armies. And the bosses, while still tough, have the exact same stats they do on normal mode. That's one interesting thing about this game. I looked up the boss stats on Serenae's Forest, and it turns out that there is really no difference between the bosses on normal and the bosses on hard. The only mode that affects the bosses is easy, and that really only applies to the very early game bosses and removing Imbue from the Black Knights. Kind of interesting that. I've always considered Radiant Dawn to have some of the tougher bosses by Fire Emblem standards, but I never realized their stats were outright identical between normal and hard. This means that, like I said, endgame is pretty much exactly the same as how I'd play it on normal. But one of the things I love most about Radiant Dawn's endgame is kind of impossible on this difficulty, and it may be the main reason why I don't plan on replaying hard anytime soon. One of the things that I love about Radiant Dawn is how you're able to create your own personal team of legendary heroes. Thanks to bonus experience, it's possible to make nearly any character an ultimate juggernaut of destruction. Heck, on my second ever playthrough, I brought Meg and Astrid to endgame, and both were very good there. Combined with the blessing system, which lets you turn any weapon you want into an infinite use boss killer, and there's so much room to truly make the endgame team your own. You will choose the characters through the game that you've bonded the most with. You can use bonus experience to make them all super powerful, give them all amazing weapons, and just completely demolish the hordes of enemies in the endgame. Radiant Dawn's endgame is extremely easy, but to me it's one of the most cathartic experiences in any game. You're able to see your characters who have grown over the course of this journey. You have your own personal band of chosen ones, all of them an ultimate legendary hero with the best stats and weapons that you will see in any game in the series, except maybe FE4, and nothing can stand in their way. And one of the biggest joys of Radiant Dawn to me, and one of the reasons why I think it has such replay value, at least to someone who plays the games the way I do, is going through the game again and choosing a different party to bring to endgame. If you don't care about efficiency, which I never personally have, anyone can be a legendary hero in Radiant Dawn, and that's one of the things I love about it. And it's one thing that's gone completely on hard mode. With the absolute gutting of bonus experience, and the fact that you don't gain much experience through regular gameplay, and the increased enemy stats meaning that anyone who has a bad start simply cannot catch up, hard mode basically forces you to use only the best. Yes, I used Har, Titania, Shinnen, all of the most overpowered characters except possibly Edward in this run, and I felt like I had to because I just wanted to finish hard. I wanted to prove I could do it. I, at one point, seriously considered using Meg because I was thinking, oh hey, I just want to be the guy who can brag that he beat hard mode with Meg. But I saw her starting stats, I tried her in 1-4, and she just couldn't kill anything and gain the experience she needed to become relevant. Aaron too. Normally, I like to use him during part 3, even though I rarely bring him to endgame. But here on hard mode, enemy stats meant that he just couldn't get the start he needed, and I was forced to bench him after only 1 or 2 chapters. Sure, getting through the game with all of the most broken and overpowered party members is fun the first time you do it. To me, being forced to only use one party to be viable ruins a lot of the replay value of the game, and it ruins a lot of the reasons why I play Fire Emblem personally. Remember, this is just the way that I personally play, and other people get enjoyment out of other things, and that's fine. But with the way that I personally play, hard mode just isn't that fun for me beyond one playthrough. And because of that, I doubt I'm going to try this again. It was good proving that I could actually do it, but I don't see me having fun going back to it. When I do my recorded playthrough of this game, I will be playing on normal mode, which is the Japanese hard mode. That's the difficulty that I usually play it on. I've actually never played easy/Japanese normal. Playing Radiant Dawn on its highest difficulty was a fun experience, don't get me wrong, but it's still not my personal thing. I'm glad that I did it though. Very, very glad that I did it. I'm glad that I got to experience a new side of one of my favourite games of all time. And that should be a good note to leave this on. I'm sorry if this went on a bit long, but I love this game and I have a lot to say about it. And I hope to see you again for whatever I end up doing next. Just showing the final clear data here, and I should say first, I am as shocked as all of you that Neffany somehow beat Ha. When I saw Ha come in second, I instantly blurted out, wait, really? Pretty shocked she actually won, and this is the second playthrough of mine that Neffany got first in. I guess her availability is just that good. But anyway, what also surprises me is, I boss abused for over 60 turns in one endgame, and I still ended up beating most of my other playthroughs that were on a lower difficulty by over 50 turns. What was I doing during those first two playthroughs? I honestly have no idea, because this hard mode run I personally considered to be very clumsy in terms of turn count, and I boss abused for 60 turns, and I took, like, I don't even know how that happened. I was, like, 10 years younger when I did those two playthroughs, but I'm very confused. I'm really confused. I wish I could go back in time and see what my past self was doing during those chapters, because how did that happen?